Hello everybody. So I just looked up and apparently they have finally decided to finish the mushroom trial, and as far as the judge has finally finished giving directions. So we enter the final stage, well not quite the final stage because you still have sentencing if she's found guilty, but the final stage, which is the jury deliberations. We've finally entered that. Oh my God. So I want to just remind people, and now, okay, I haven't worked in every single criminal trial out there, but I did a lot of supportive work, we'll say, for different legal jurisdictions. And I probably worked on around 700 criminal cases that made it to Supreme Court or somewhere around that level. And I also, out of them, there was probably about 100 murder trials. So the others were sexual assault, that sort of thing, or other ones. Anyway, so not all murders. But now, out of those ones, I can give you some statistics. So the average length of the trials was about 6 weeks. So this one was about 6 weeks for the main part of the trial. It was an average length trial. It wasn't the longest trial I've heard. All right, so we've had trials up to 20 weeks. So this, even if you include, now I think we're into the 10th week, it's nowhere near the longest trial. And I'm not counting the civil ones. I also worked on some civil trials that lasted for years. We had ones that were like 3 years long, and oh goodness, there was a word for it, but basically some civil trials will get to the stage where neither side wanted the case to ever finish. So there were companies that had enough money to just pay lawyer fees for expensive barristers, often teams of barristers, for years on end. And in the end, they didn't want them to finish, because then they'd have to find someone guilty, someone goes to jail, and someone's out of business, or, and they didn't want to risk that. So essentially, forever trials. So I did work on forever trials, and the different words that they'd have for them, but essentially ones that would never end. You never get that in a criminal trial. Criminal trials tend to be shorter, but even criminal trials, they do have some that are 20 weeks that are longer than that. So a 9 or 10 week trial is not exceptionally long. Now, the thing that is unusual about this one is the amount of time that they've spent on the closing statements, and in particular the judge, the judge's direction. So in this trial, the closing statements went for 2 days for prosecution, 2 days for defence, and 5 days across 2 different weeks for the judge's directions. Now, this is unheard of. You never get them that long, particularly considering the length of the trial. So in your typical 6-week trial, so the main part of the trial is 6 weeks, right? That's your average length of trial. So this was a 6-week trial. It was an average length of trial. It wasn't an unusually long one. It was a 6-week trial. I'd argue it wasn't exceptionally complicated either. It was a moderately, I wouldn't say it was completely simple, but it was relatively straightforward. This case is not all that complicated. And I'll explain why it's not all that complicated. You might say, well, there were 3 different murders and 1 attempted murder. But effectively it was one case, because it was all one action. So it's essentially, you may as well think of it as 1 murder and 1 culprit and 1 set of victims. So it's not like you have victims and they may have been murdered by different people, because you do get that. You get ones where there's a group of 4 people and they all deny it, and there's different theories where it may have been just 2 of them, may have been 3 of them, and so forth. That's not the case here. This is a case where there's 1 person and 1 person only that's being accused. And in fact, we know that she did it. We know that she put the death cap mushrooms in there, she cooked the meal, and she fed it to them, and that as a direct result of feeding them, 3 people died and 1 was in hospital and almost died. So we've established most of the facts that we would argue over. So look, in most trials, you'd be arguing over whether she did it. Like, it might be something like, oh, there was a bullet in the brain, but we don't know who shot it. We've actually got a witness. You almost never get a witness in a murder trial. Certainly, it's unusual to have a witness that was a victim, but one of the victims. But he's the attempted murder one. So you'd often get a witness if it's an attempted murder, but you wouldn't normally have it where there's an attempted murder and in the same act there were 3 murders. That's very unusual. So you've got all those elements that make this much simpler than your typical murder case. Much simpler, not more complicated, much simpler. And your average one, again, is... I mean, murder cases can be a bit longer, so I'd say 6 to 8 weeks. That's your average case for your murder trial. And look, they can balloon out. But they balloon out when there's multiple people being accused at the same time. This is why when you've got multiple people that might have done the murder, they're not sure whether to try them as one trial or separate trials. Sometimes they do it as one trial, sometimes they do it as separate trials. Sometimes where there's multiple victims, they will do them as separate trials as well, even if it's one culprit. So, and sometimes the juries aren't allowed to know about the other ones that they're being accused of. So, no, this is absolutely simple. It's very, very, very simple. You're looking at a very narrow thing, which is you have to determine whether or not she did it on purpose. Not whether she did it, because we know she did it. That element's already fulfilled. And I mean, I've gone over how it is actually possible that somebody else put the death cap mushrooms in, and probably if you were looking at who else could have done it and who else had motive to do it, it would have been her husband, her estranged husband, Simon. So there is a possibility of someone else, but that he's by far the strongest possibility, if it was someone else. However, it's not open to the jury. Well, it sort of is, but it hasn't been... Well, the jury's allowed to speculate that. They're allowed to speculate whatever they want. But it hasn't been presented by the defence. In some cases like this, you would have that sort of thing presented by the defence. I've certainly seen murder cases where they have explicitly said, oh yeah, somebody else, and they've named who else could have done the murders. I have seen that. I've seen that work, and I've seen it not work. Where effectively the defence says, oh yeah, there was a murder, but this other person did it. And they'd say who. Sometimes they'll even say, oh, there's 3 or 4 people or 3 or 4 groups of people. So the jury are not dealing with anything like that in this case. We're not dealing with her saying she was framed. That's quite common in murder trials. In fact, it's quite common for people actually to be framed for murder. Often when there hasn't been a death, or where there was a death but the death was accidental and they were framed. That's a common defence. We're not even looking for that. They're not suggesting that anyone framed her. I mean, I could have said her husband could have done it. He could have framed her for it. Well, it was an accidental death, but he made it look like murder to hurt her, and also because of the whole thing where he wants custody of the children. I mean, the result of this, and you've got to realise this. The result of this is that I'd say even now she's probably lost custody of the children, and she's only a chance of getting them back if she's found not guilty. Now the jury aren't supposed to know that, hasn't been in the media, but I'd say that would happen. That would be the case. That right now Simon has full custody of the children. If she goes to jail, it's a given that he would get full custody of them. They're minors, they're underage, so he'd get 100% custody. And now they wouldn't be allowed to know that. I think you could probably work that out. That's a motivation for him to frame her, to set her up, to lie about the whole thing, and so forth. So, you know, and to do the whole thing, if he put the death caps in there. So there's all that sort of thing that could complicate it, but the defence haven't gone with a complicated scenario. They've gone with something very simple. They've just left it at, this is not even possible to have happened. And that's all that the jury has to think about. So I just have to say, okay, the length of the trial is not unusually long. It's not. I've seen even murder trials that were 4 weeks. So this was 6, but it's now gone out to 10 with all the instructions and everything. It's not unusually long. It's probably at average length, maybe even a little bit on the shorter side as far as murders are concerned. I mean, if you compare it with the Puff Daddy one, the Puff Daddy one's longer. That's in America. There was one with Carr and Reed. It was a single murder. I think that was longer. And there's the big trials that are much longer. You know, your Oscar Pistorius ones, the what was that guy's name? The Juice, what was his name? Anyway, yeah, there's the Michael Jackson trial. There's some really, really, really long trials. This was not a really, really, really long trial. But the thing is, closing arguments. Now, I'll tell you how long your typical amount of closing arguments are. That's usually reflected by the length of the trial. So for, let's say, your average 6-week trial, I'd have the end of 6 weeks, you'd normally have 1 day for closing arguments. You'd start with the prosecution, and the judge would usually time limit it. And they'd say, righto, prosecution, they start the trial, they normally start the day at 11 a.m. Say, right, you have until lunchtime. So from 11 to 1, that's your time. They might take a 10-minute break at 12 o'clock. They come back and they finish them. You'd have the bit between opening the court at 11 o'clock and closing it for lunch at 1. That's your prosecution's time. If you haven't finished, tough luck. You've got to stop. And that's the closing arguments. Now that's your typical average closing argument. And I can tell you that the normal closing argument after lunch would be defence. So they'd come back, let's say 2 o'clock. They'd go 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. That's your closing argument for defence. And if you're not finished, tough luck. You could probably ask for a few extra minutes. They might give you an extra 15, but they're not going to give you hours longer. And the judge would normally give instructions. This is how long you have to explain it. Not going to let you go over that time. And then the judge's instructions. Now it depends on the judge. Some judges will say, "All right, you're all dismissed for the day," and then he'd come back at 4:30 and give instructions to the jury. And that would be between 4:30 and 5. He'd give half an hour worth. So he'd have 2 hours prosecution, 2 hours defence, half an hour judge instructions, all on the same day. Now it does depend on the judge. Some judges like to do that in response to the case, in which case they do it on the day. And others like to do it in response to the closing statements or closing arguments, and in which case he might want to do it the next day. However, most judges will require for the closing arguments to be submitted in advance, usually a few days in advance, and they'll be submitted not only to the judge but to the other side. So the prosecution will give their closing arguments to defence will give their closing arguments to prosecution. And in fact, they usually will require for the whole case to be done like that, so that both sides know in advance what they're dealing with. Because the aim of a trial is not to pit prosecution against defence. The aim of the trial is to get justice. Now, if you're pitting them against each other, they go, "Oh, surprise!" and that's how it looks in a movie, in a TV show, that sort of thing. But in real life, they're usually, prosecution and defence will all get together and work out if they're guilty or not. And that's usually what happens. Because they're servants of the law. They're not servants of the client. That's secondary. They might support their client and they want to give their client the best case of justice, best chance and all that. But they'll say, all right, well, we know we're probably going to lose, but one side will know they're probably going to lose, the other side will know they're probably going to win, and they say, but there's this fact that we're not sure about. And I go, okay. But even if they're confident they're going to win or they're confident they're going to lose, they'll still fight it out. I mean, public defenders are required to fight it out. If they might instruct their client to plead guilty, and they might say, look, you're going to lose this. You're going to get a better deal if you say guilty. But on the other side, the prosecution might say, oh look, we can't prove guilt here, but we're required to prosecute because this is in the public interest. Now, prosecution will often drop cases. Quite common. It's a lot more common than people think it is. So they don't usually make the media, because they're not allowed to drop cases if they're in the public interest. So this case, for example, it can't be dropped by the prosecution because it's in the public interest. In fact, that's the case for most murder trials. But really anything that's in the media, you can't drop it. So, but if it's not in the media, let's say that there was a sexual assault. It wouldn't happen with murder, but with a sexual assault, it was one that didn't make the papers. Nobody knew about, and they're obviously not guilty. Prosecution are just going to drop it, and that happens all the time. So, yeah, and it's not just, they're obviously not guilty, but it's also they haven't got the evidence. So they might think that they're guilty, but if they don't have the evidence, they're not going to do it. And they do an analysis beforehand, all that sort of stuff. So the thing is, and I have to argue this, why are they having 2 days of prosecution closing statements when it's normally about 2 hours? Average 2 hours. Why is it 2 days? So 2 days, okay, they only have, a 5-hour day. And I mean, most days are only 4 hours. So most days of those 2 sessions, it's usually about half the days of 4 hours and half the days of 5. Because the third session is usually up to the judge's discretion. Now, over a short trial, they might say, oh, look, we'll have an extended long session and the day will last 7 hours. If it's only a 1-day trial, they often do that. Or if it's a 2-day trial and they want to squeeze it in. But over a lengthy trial of, 6-8 weeks, they're not likely to do that. They're going to pace themselves. They're going to do 4-hour days. Sometimes they'll do 5 hours if it's needed, but they won't really go beyond that. So I haven't checked this trial, but as far as I can tell, they're mostly 4 and 5 day trials. He took the Monday off last week. Brought the jury back on Tuesday for the judge's directions. So normally you'd get 2 hours. Now, I have seen cases where it's gone for the whole day. It's gone a full 4-hour day, just for prosecution. Normally they'd give them the direction. They say you've got one session, you've got 2 hours. But sometimes they'll say, look, we need more than 2 hours. Or sometimes they'll get to the 2 hours and the judge will say, have you finished? Have you almost finished? Do you want an extra 15 minutes? And they'll say, look, I need a whole other session. So they'll go to 2 sessions and have 4 hours. And sometimes they'll say, all right, do you need that third session? You want to go to 5 hours? And they'll say yes. And sometimes they'll even say, all right, do you want to go to the 6 hour? We can even have a lengthy session today. Or do you want to go to the second day? I have seen them go to the second day and do a day and a half. I've never seen them do 2 days. All right, so this is already the longest prosecution closing statement I've ever seen. Now, okay, there's probably people more experienced than me, but it's an exceptionally long closing statement. And the defence closing statement was just as long. Of course, arguably it has to be, because the prosecution closing statement has to be this long. But even with that, you still don't need the judge's directions to be 5 days. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then back here on this Monday. Now they're finished now, yay, good for that. But why do they need 5 days? That's longer than the combination of the prosecution cases for both sides combined. You don't need it that long. And I'm not sure why you need that. I mean, all the judge needed to say was, this is what you need to find, this is how you interpret the evidence. And we saw that with like the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard case. And I know that was civil, and that was in America, but that was like 2 hours of judges' directions. You don't need 5 days. Don't know how many hours he was having each day, but that's too long. It's not that complicated a case. Another thing I wanted to touch on here was I briefly had a look at a live blog of the judge's directions from today. Now, they're not allowed to say word for word, so they paraphrased it. And they did it in little 15-minute blocks. So every 15 minutes, they'd put a block of, it looked like about 3 or 4 minutes worth of typing. So they've put their favourite 3 or 4 minutes out of the 15 minutes. So it's not word for word, but it was fairly, like, relatively close to word for word. It's not. I mean, it's live. And I was looking at that and I was going, well, this is odd, because some of the things that they were saying were completely different to what any media were reporting. And I'll say one example of it was in this live blog. They were saying that not only were there no grey plates, but that actually Ian, the survivor, his testimony was that there was one set of plates for the 4 guests, and there was a different plate which he actually described as rusty. Not orange or tan, but rusty. And he didn't describe the colour of the other 4, he just said they were one set. And that was his actual evidence. Now, I thought it was interesting because all the media, every single one of them, says grey. Now, I don't know if his witness statement says grey and he just in trial said one set without saying the colour. But the judge made it clear. He said, in his judge's instructions, said they weren't grey, they were one set. Now, I can say, okay, him saying rusty versus him saying orange or tan, rusty, orange, tan, all pretty much the same colour, fair enough. And then there was also the evidence from Simon, the husband, that said, she doesn't have a set. She doesn't have grey plates. She has single plates. And I know some people do that. It's a bit ugly, but some people do that. And this is my guess, is that Ian, the survivor, probably in his head thought, they would have had a set. She would have had a set, because most people do have sets. Now, I've always had a set. I mean, if you break a few plates, you can lose your set, and you get a new set. I mean, that's what happens. And I know myself, like, if, let's say you have a set of 6, and you break one and you've got a set of 5, you break another, you've got a set of 4, and once you get down to 3, you go, well, I better get another set. And you still might use those 3, but you won't use them for a dinner party sort of thing, because you want to have them matching. And that's what most people do, but some people like individuals and individual plates that don't match. There are people like that. So apparently she was the kind of person that doesn't have plates that match, and she doesn't own a grey plate. That doesn't mean he's lying, that just means he's mistaken. And you see, the thing is, you think it doesn't matter, so it doesn't mean make him a liar. But what it does is it means that big evidence, the big bombshell, so the prosecution tries to make it seem like a bombshell about, she had a separate plate for her, was not a bombshell. And in fact, they admitted, he went over again in his statements. He said, and remember that Ian, the sole survivor, he didn't at any stage say that they had to sit on a particular spot. At no stage did they say that. And again, that's contradictory to what the media is saying. So you might think, okay, now there was more than one blog covering these judge's statements, judge's instructions. You might think, all these other blogs are going to be in lockstep with this because he's correcting this misinformation that's making the rounds around media. But all the other ones, they weren't doing little 15-minute segments. They were doing little 2-hour segments. They were summarising the whole session. So the 2-hour session, say from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. sort of thing. And they were doing a 5-minute wrap-up of everything that went on in those 2 hours. And I was looking for it. I was looking for where they corrected that mistake about the plates. No. They all said he just reiterated that. And that's just a complete lie. And now they might not be lying because they're just cherry picking facts. But it's so biased that it gets to dishonesty. And Now, I'm not going to criticise media, because in every case that I worked on, the media reported on it inaccurately. Now, in some cases, you'd get it where the media, there'd be two opposing medias. So you get the ones that would support the prosecution, the ones that support defence. Sometimes all the media support defence, sometimes all the media support prosecution. This is a case where all the media is supporting prosecution. It's not the only case where that's happened, not at all. It's not even unusual for that to happen. Essentially, you do get media coverage in three types. You get all prosecution, all defence, or 50-50. Oh, look, you can get ones where it's more prosecution than defence. Occasionally, but this is unusual, occasionally the media will actually change their mind as they're going. I saw that in the Johnny Depp case, for example, that when the case began, they were all against him, or mostly against him, and as the case progressed, people started supporting him. That's unusual. That's not normal. Normally their mind's made up before the case begins, and they'll just decide. And that's the normal thing. And you do get 50-50 ones where half is on prosecution, half on defence before the case begins. And now, in some countries, like for example in USA, they allow media to manipulate trials. They allow jury members to know what the media is saying. They allow jury members to speak to the media while they're still on the jury, and at least afterwards. I don't know if that's USA-wide or just certain states, but certainly that seems to be the case. We've seen that happen. That would be illegal in Australia. That definitely doesn't happen here. Media aren't allowed to talk to juries even after the case is finished. So if I was on a jury, I wouldn't be allowed to speak about it. In cases I've worked on, I'm not allowed to speak about them directly. So it's, the judge's instructions, according to the live blog, seemed accurate. And you know how I was saying in previous videos, that it sounded to me as if whatever the judge's instructions were, if that's what he's actually saying, he may well be, well, perhaps not breaking the law, but certainly biasing and corrupting the case. And but it seems as if, based on what I saw in the live blog, he's probably not doing that. And again, I'm not there, I don't know. But it seems more as if the media are simply manipulating things. Even still, I wonder why we need to have 5 days, or a bit over a week, effectively, of judges' instructions. I've never heard of that. Maybe it happens. I haven't been to every court case in the history of the world or even the history of Australia, but I don't believe that that's ever happened before. Certainly not. I've never witnessed it. It's most definitely unusual. The length of the case, again, is not unusually long. And indeed, I'd argue that this case was on the simpler side of murder cases. It's not a complicated one. It's not one where you have to dig through things and work out this and that and all that sort of stuff. For example, I'd argue that the one where Joanne Lees was supposedly the witness for the murder of Peter Falconio, that was far more complicated than this one. You didn't even have a body there. You didn't know who'd done it. Didn't know if anything had happened. That was much more complicated than this. This one's quite simple. And essentially all they have to work out is, did she eat the meal or did she not? She ate the meal, she's innocent. She didn't eat the meal, she's guilty. And essentially you've got to say, did she cook 6 meals or did she cook 1? She cooked 1, she ate the meal, she's not guilty. She cooked 6, she didn't eat the meal, she's guilty. Now, it's not quite that simple, but it's essentially that simple. It's roughly that simple. And I still think the judge has erred in not dumbing it down in that way. Fuck me. I think the judge should have simplified it that way. Maybe there's some legal argument as to why he shouldn't, but I've certainly seen that sort of thing before. I'm not sure why they didn't do that. Maybe they did and it just wasn't listed in the media. I don't know why there wasn't a live demonstration of them cooking the meal. That's quite normal in murder cases or any kind of criminal cases. You'd have a physical demonstration. When we had the Joanne Lees one in Barrow Creek with Peter Falconio, they had a live demonstration of how he took them, how he kidnapped them, how he tied her up, all that sort of stuff. Why couldn't you have had them cooking the meal? Why couldn't you have had a live demonstration? Would have been very helpful. So there's a few strange things about this trial. The length of the closing statements is unusually long. Judge's instructions extraordinarily long. And the lack of a step-by-step doing the cooking is very strange. Judge also instructed that some of the evidence was simply false. And most of it was the prosecution evidence. And I just noticed that. And I was going, oh, okay. So the prosecution completely lied about some claims about poisoning and how it works. And I was going, oh, that's interesting. But again, you had the people that were summarising it for the whole session. They didn't mention that. They just continued with what was in their narrative. And I find that disappointing. And if I hadn't worked in the law, I wouldn't necessarily be aware. I'd think, oh, the media's presenting it correctly. Of course they do. There's laws, they have to. Well, one thing that's a lie, and another thing, there's a certain way to present it where it's not completely illegally lying, but it's definitely not truthful. And that's what they do. So they'll say, oh, no, look, you know, we just present, oh, the prosecution said it. Yeah, because they want you to know about the prosecution thing. So they make a big deal about the prosecution. They barely mention the defence. And the defence cross-examined and found all sorts of exciting things. They're not mentioning it. And equally, when the defence was having their bit, they don't mention any of the stuff that the defence said. They only mention the cross-examination by prosecution. And that's how they lie, because they're only showing one side. And it's not technically lying, so they get away with it. But again, a lot of them are being sued over this, and they're losing lawsuits. A lot of media outlets in relation to this. So they are certainly breaking the law a lot. And we've got to highlight just how much. I mean, there's at least 5 cases where they've been in trouble for that sort of thing. Now, I don't know all the details of what they're in trouble for, but you don't normally have any, we'll just say. And maybe that's why the instructions were that long, because I think they're very, very scared that there will be media manipulation. I'd say that's the only way prosecution wins, is if the members of the jury end up hearing from someone or reading something on the newspaper or in the media or something that convinces them that they're guilty when they're clearly not. Because if they're aware that everyone thinks she's guilty, they might just find her guilty. Then they'll look it up and everyone's saying, oh, obviously guilty. Oh, look at this, it's not even a question. If they're aware of that, that's going to manipulate them. And I mean, that's pretty much what happened in the George Pell case. So, yeah, I'd say, looking at what I saw today, that the judge thinks she's going to be found not guilty. But who knows? We'll see what happens. And I don't know how long they'll deliberate for, but if you get a week worth of closing statements and another week and a bit worth of judge's instructions, you're going to expect at least 8 weeks of deliberations. And you often have 8 weeks of deliberations even for a short trial. I'd be surprised if it's like tomorrow. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.